When you think of the prequel era of Star Wars, you likely either think about one or two things first. Either the divisiveness of the movies or the practically unanimous love of the Clone Wars. Personally, I've always been a huge fan of the whole era and its whole aesthetic, growing up away from the immense prequel hate. However, the movies always stuck out more to me. This was primarily due to my discovery of the Clone Wars being through Netflix, when the show had already finished its main airing, so I didn't have a strong connection to it like everyone else. To this day, I've probably only watched 40% of the episodes. I know that's gonna get the fans trying to kill my ass. I'm sorry. Despite my lack of nostalgia for the Clone Wars, however, I was still beyond excited to check out Season 7 when the show returned on Disney Plus in 2020, hyped to be able to watch the show weekly for the first time. The final arc was peak fiction, up there with the greats, such as the holiday special. The second arc with the Karen sisters was more filler than Naruto, with a more repetitive story than a Sniper Wolf video. And the first arc, focusing on Anakin, with an entirely new group of clones with unique quirks, known as Clone Force 99, soon to be the Bad Batch, was just average. Like a bag of plain chips. An entirely black, white, or gray outfit. Perfectly good, but nothing special. Each member had a defining characteristic, Hunter being the leader, Wrecker the lovable dumb muscle, Tech the smart one, and Crosshair the long-range combatant. Beyond that, though, most of them didn't have super deep personalities. Granted, they were characters introduced in a final season, limited to only appearing in the first third as well, so it was unrealistic to expect some Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul level character growth. This lack of development was what made the initial announcement of a Clone Wars spin-off following them a bit conflicting. We could have gotten a spin-off on Rex, Cody, Fives, any of the ever-growing roster of surviving Order 66 Jedi at this point. Hell, fucking Maul. But instead we were getting one on a group of characters we had only just been introduced to. Now, 3 years after the first episode dropped, the show has finally concluded its third and final season. Well, not yet, as I'm writing this script a few days prior to the finale. And I'm proud to say that it was as good, if not better in some aspects, as its predecessor. Today, I'll be going over my general thoughts on the final season, saving the final episode for the end. I was planning to go over each individual episode, but I don't believe that it really works for this season, as it is more serialized than the other two in my opinion. Sure, a lot of the episodes have self-contained missions still, such as the one focusing on Asajj Ventress, the one where Hunter and Wrecker attempt to find Fennec Shand for info, and the one where the Bad Batch goes to free Rampart. But it's all connected to Tantus and the cloning research being done, as opposed to random Sid missions for an episode of the week. Overall, this works heavily in the season's favor, as it's able to tell one long, compelling story, as opposed to short bits that lead nowhere. Damn, not having Sid missions this season is a godsend. It felt like every few episodes in the previous seasons, Sid would just pull a new enemy or MacGuffin out of her ass, forcing the Batch, who had initially declined, to deal with it once Omega got involved. Hey guys, this guy stole my bantha milk. Hey guys, go kill this animal for materials. The formula got more predictable than a damn Power Rangers episode, which is constantly criticized for its Monster of the Week format. But at least Power Rangers usually had an interesting new monster or moral each week, instead of repeating the same one. I did find Sid's complete absence this season disappointing though, as the Batch never get to pummel her face in both for selling them out and making us, the audience, sit through filler. Another downside to this season's new structural approach though, is that I left a lot of the episodes feeling that nothing much had progressed. A major example of this is in the first three, which are all nearly entirely dedicated to Omega and Crosshair's escape, along with a nice but small subplot of Hunter and Wrecker helping out some clones from a facility much like Omega's. Having episode 1 end with Omega failing to escape, which gave me huge vibes to the second arc of Clone Wars Season 7, made the first episode feel somewhat useless, even with the first 3 episodes being released together. Imagine how much worse the pacing would be if the episodes were all released one by one. Let's talk about the characters now, starting with the growth that each of our 5 protagonists, including Omega, another clone added to the batch in the first season, essentially becoming the central protagonist, goes through. Well, actually, we'll start with why there's not 6 protagonists, as Tech actually stayed dead. I did have hope that the writers would keep him buried, as his arc ended perfectly last season with Fee. So bringing him back would serve no purpose other than eliminating stakes and reducing him back to the gimmicky smart guy he was in Season 1. Good on the writers for not just pulling a fake-out death like certain other Star Wars media. Rain Chewie. Unfortunately for Wrecker, he retained his gimmick for the entire show, never really growing beyond it. In the entire 47-episode run, the only development he really got was forming a bit of a bond with Omega, which softened him up a tiny bit. But even that is somewhat reaching, and he should have definitely gotten some less subtle development. As for Echo, he was unfortunately sidelined for most of this season, leaving the batch halfway through until the last few episodes to go join Rex in his growing clone rebellion. I predicted something like this would happen, so that we could have a way to see more of Rex's journey before the end of the series, so I originally assumed that if anyone would be given development, it would be Echo. Surprisingly though, the season did not focus nearly as much on Rex and his clones as everyone was likely anticipating, so Echo ended up essentially being written off for a while. He did at least get development during the Clone Wars, so he's not in as bad shape as Wrecker, and hey, at least Echo had a role to play in the finale. Hunter is another character whose role I was surprised by, taking more of a backseat for once. As I'm recording this before watching the finale, I'm currently predicting that his lesser role is signifying his death. Omega being on her own for most of the season has proved that Hunter isn't needed to mentor her anymore, and Hunter has completed his arc of learning not to run from the Empire, so the only thing left to do with him is tie up his relationship with Crosshair and probably have him be a last push of motivation for Omega in the finale. Now for the fan service and side characters this season brings. Thankfully, much like Andor, while relying heavily on existing lore, the fan service characters are minimal. Aside from obvious characters like Rex, the only returning characters we see are Palpatine and Tarkin, Cad Bane and Fennec Shan, and Asajj Ventress. All of these characters play crucial roles in the story, although I do believe Ventress was hyped up too much. She only comes in for one episode, delivers some exposition about M-counts, trains Omega a bit, and that's it. Well, that's fine in isolation, as this isn't the Asajj Ventress show. She should not have been hyped up as this huge return, only to just appear once. I mean, she was the main marketing draw for this season, and she was only in one episode? Are you kidding? Now it's time for Omega and her overall importance. Although I don't advocate for the mindless fan service and cameos, and acknowledge the beauty and necessity of mostly standalone projects like Andor, I am genuinely always looking for a connection and cohesion between projects so that everything feels purposeful and a part of the current Star Wars zeitgeist. The Bad Batch's main relevance in the current zeitgeist is the focus on cloning and Palpatine's plan with it. They're obviously building towards The Mandalorian, which itself is building to the Rise of Skywalker. Ew. All of these Dave Filoni projects are attempting to do the seemingly impossible task of explaining the somehow Palpatine returned meme. I'm aware of the many negative reactions to this, but I believe this to be nothing but a good thing. Think of how the Clone Wars enhanced the prequels, making the era more beloved by fixing some issues. I don't understand why you'd be against that same enhancement being gifted toward the sequels, especially through a Clone Wars sequel, as they aren't being decanonized no matter how much the fandom pleads, due to this thing called money. The Bad Batch in particular is building to the sequels through Omega, with her essentially having a suitable midichlorian count for the cloning project, finally explaining why the Empire has been after her throughout the show's run. This was a great plot until it was tarnished by the finale a bit. Yes, that's right. The rest of this review, I have now watched the finale. I think it's time we get to the finale, as it's what I really have been wanting to speak on, since it somehow changed my overall thoughts on the season quite drastically. To start, I'd like to say how much I appreciated the finale's longer runtime. If there was one thing it had going for it, it was absolutely the pacing, with every moment having time to soak in. Another moment I have to give credit to is Omega saving the kids, helping them end up safely on Babu. It was a great way to showcase her growth, as these kids mirrored her from the show's genesis, viewed as nothing but tools for experimentation and effectively being brainwashed into believing there was nothing wrong with that. In a way, this made Omega mirror Nala Se, being their one guardian angel, much like she was to her. She quite literally becomes an angel as she is killed by Rampart, but not before taking him down with her in a badass highlight moment. The only thing that could have enhanced her death was a reaction from Omega, which we unfortunately don't receive. I understand why it didn't happen, as the characters were in entirely different places, rendering a scene like that impossible. But I can't help imagining the scene where Omega is having trouble getting the kids to safety with Emery, who then is somehow informed of Nala's death, which then gives Omega that extra push of motivation to save the kids in honor of her. I guess I kind of brushed past how Rampart killed her and died, huh? It was definitely something I expected. After all, he had no reason whatsoever to stay loyal to the Batch. I'm just glad he wasn't working for the Empire in disguise, which I've actually seen articles claim was the case in this episode, but that is misinformation. His whole reasoning for betrayal was to steal Hemlock's plans so he can simply have leverage on them. I don't think that implies he was working for them, but rather he was just gonna bribe them for resources or something. That was a good way to not backpedal on his development, but keeping him hateable as fuck at the same time. Especially when he casually offs Nala Se. I'd like to address that further. The show actually killed another main character, stakes we haven't seen since the Season 2 finale, which itself was a shocking occurrence. I do wish there would have been a bit more carnage, but I'll take what I can get. I'm not saying this show needs constant death to stay interesting, but I expected the final season to go all out, not having to maintain an episodic status quo anymore, of keeping the entire group unharmed so that you could jump into the next episode without being too confused, since there would be no new episodes. I figured Tech's death was only the first sign of the tragedy that was going to ensue, but that was not the case, as every other batch member survived. This only makes Tech's death more tragic, as the writers used him to bait us into thinking the others could meet similar fates. This did at least make the finale a more enjoyable watch though, as I thought it was basically confirmed they would kill at least one batch member. I can't overstate how Nala really ended up being the MVP though. She killed the show's first main villain, actually added to the stakes by being killed, and she destroyed Hemlock's lab, along with all of his Project Necromancer plans, with the same bomb that offed Rampart. That's right, one of the main things that I praise the show for. Its overall contribution to the canon is now virtually destroyed. I suppose that provides an explanation for why the project had to be fully rebooted by The Mandalorian, and why Grogu specifically was valued so much as a blood donor, since Omega, despite also having the potential, was presumably never discovered by any of the Imperial remnants who survived. However, just because it makes sense doesn't mean it was entirely justified, as it makes the events of the Bad Batch appear somewhat inconsequential. If all of the cloning focus was going to lead nowhere, I would have preferred the show to focus more of that time on other clones. One of the best characters from Season 1, Hauser for example, I think was compelling enough to at least lead his own subplot, and I know I'm not the only one with that opinion. Hell, what about Wolf? He was a major focus of Episode 8 of Season 3, and they could have focused on him more as well. You could even introduce new clones and add subplots following their perspectives. Some of the best episodes of Season 2 were the Crosshair Solar episodes with every trooper that he interacted with, proving that you could have multiple episodes without the batch themselves, and still have them fit perfectly thematically into the story, especially if you cross them over with the batch eventually. I'm not saying the show's main characters should be entirely sidelined, as they already didn't get enough development, but if the plan was to have a subplot, I believe one of the clones would have been better, as opposed to a directionless one. Speaking of directionless, we also never found out the specific identity of that mysterious trooper. What the fuck was that about? He was obviously no one important, but why even build a mystery around him then? We know he was Hemlock's trooper, but it was implied he himself was special, no? Perhaps I misunderstood. Now let's move on to a final section talking about the show's resolution, both in terms of plot and characters. Following Nala Se's death, Hemlock eventually tries to escape with Omega, who had managed to free the rest of the batch from their captivity. This leads to Hemlock's last stand with Hunter and Crosshair as they all point their guns, Hemlock pulling the classic trope of, "If you shoot me, she dies," with Omega. This reminded me of the opening scene of GTA 5 out of all the possible examples of this trope. I don't know why. There's plenty of other examples. Crosshair manages to successfully take the shot at Hemlock, with support from Omega ramming a surgical tool into Hemlock's arm. I believe this was satisfying for Crosshair's arc and redemption, sticking it to the Empire and saving Omega, who he had developed a close relationship with throughout the season, particularly in both Episode 4 and in their moments on Pabu, when Omega taught him not to hold his own past against him. This was a great way to differentiate Crosshair's redemption from the many, many others in the franchise, who often don't question if they deserve their redemption. Ironically, despite the sequel's problems, Kylo Ren is the closest example I can think of, although the two characters are very different. I also enjoyed a few subtle moments earlier in the finale, where Crosshair suggests staying behind to stop the Zillo Beast on his own, encouraging his brothers to go on ahead. Certainly a far cry from the beginning of the series, huh? Anyways, remember how I mentioned that Hunter was in this scene? I wouldn't blame you if you forgot, as he really doesn't contribute much. A recurring theme throughout the episode until the last scene, which I guess I'm fine with. Like I said, I would have liked to see him go out in some way, but other than that, his arc was complete. You couldn't even do the sacrifice for Omega, as I suggested, as effectively as I was thinking, since that would have lessened Crosshair's arc. Perhaps it was best to keep him alive, especially if they desired a happy ending. Anyways, getting back on track, Hemlock is in fact shot and killed. I liked the way he went out, but I wish he felt like more of a threat throughout the whole season, much like Rampart in the first two seasons. I'll even go as far as to say that Hemlock reached his peak frightfulness in Season 2, even more detestable than Rampart for his involvement in Tech's death. Season 3 had his clones and Emery do the majority of the work for him, as he stayed in the background. Obviously, I didn't expect him to partake in some Jedi-level combat, but he could have had a bit more screen time at least. As far as Echo goes, he did in fact have a role to play in the finale, being the one to rally the imprisoned clones to assist in the fight, and later leaving the batch once again to help the clones settle into a new life, free to choose their own path. I appreciate Echo, one of the oldest clones in the series, being the one to have his moment, and love how the theme of the clones getting to choose their own path was concluded. From the very beginning, it was the batch who were the fortunate ones after all, as they were able to choose their own path from the get-go, unlike many of the clones with the inhibitor chips. It was beautiful to see this fortune now bless every surviving clone. My only gripe with the conclusion of Echo and these clones' arcs is how they aren't really resolved. We still don't know what becomes of them all, and why Rex, Wolf, and Gregor are the only ones together in Rebels. Thankfully, though, the show's final scene hints that there may be a third show in the works to explain this exact loose end. This final scene is a time jump to when the battle between the Rebels and Empire is in full swing. We see an older Omega and even older Hunter as Omega prepares to join the rebellion with all the skills she's picked up from her time with the batch. Wrecker and Crosshair are mentioned to still be alive, but Echo is not mentioned. This implies that he could have perished, but I have my doubts, as him perishing while fighting in a later battle for the rebellion wouldn't clear up why he wasn't with Rex and Rebels, when the rebellion was still in its founding stages at that point, further confirmed by Andor. There's also the fact that Omega specifically looks only at Tech's goggles before taking off in her ship, not any item resembling Echo, which in my opinion means that Tech was still the batch's only fatality at this point. Maybe I just have too much faith in the writers to not kill a main character off screen, but I'm gonna go with the classic rule that if you don't see a character's dead body being eaten alive by 50 maggots and or cannibals, they're still alive. Just look at Squid Game Season 2. Despite the show clearly being happy to kill off beloved characters, the one character whose body we didn't identify ended up surviving. I'm of course referring to Jun-Ho, the cop. Now as for Omega, I think we can finally determine for certain that she was this show's focal point, even without the cloning storyline. This is emphasized by her essentially becoming a fusion of all of the batch. What I mean by this is that in the end, Omega has personality traits, strategies, and skills of every member of the Bad Batch, essentially turning them all into one character, which removes the gimmicky feel of each of the main characters individually. Omega embodies Tech's intelligence and critical thinking skills, Wrecker's kindness, which yes, he does possess a lot of beneath his burly exterior, Echo's battle prowess and strategic sense, Hunter's leadership and just his general personality, and most importantly, she possesses the development and trauma on the level of Crosshair. This development allows Omega to possess all of these traits without feeling like a Mary Sue. Not to sound like one of those, Disney so woke channels. Omega being a fusion of the batch does also somewhat justify them being sidelined a little bit, as we do get to see what their developed selves could look like, just seeing it through Omega instead of them themselves. That is basically all I have to say regarding the Bad Batch Season 3. Despite its flaws, I can't deny that I enjoyed this season as a whole the most, though that is primarily due to the lack of Sid missions, and there was overall episodes from earlier seasons that I believe to be better. Specifically the Crosshair ones from Season 2 and the Ryloth two-parter from Season 1. The other two season finales were also stronger. And no, you can't even attribute them being two-parters, as the Season 3 finale is longer in overall runtime anyway. I will now officially close this video with a theory. A film theory. Don't sue me, Lee from Film Theory. You're doing a great job as the new host, by the way, as are the others. Anyways, this theory relates to Omega's future in the Star Wars universe. I originally wasn't going to include it in the review, but I think it fits, as it coming to fruition could save the cloning plot after all, redeeming my main criticism with the finale. Now, forgive me if I'm just stating the obvious here, as I haven't been keeping up with Star Wars theory tube, such as Mike Zero, but I haven't seen people mention how Omega and Grogu could be connected. They were both seen as eligible blood donors for Palpatine due to their high M counts, as I mentioned earlier, which implies that they share something in common, these high M counts. Sure, they aren't the only two characters with high M counts by any means, but the fact that Omega's was even similar to Grogu's is crazy, especially if they make Grogu's whole species potential donors, including Yoda, as that would indicate Omega has something in common with one of the most powerful and mysterious species in the Star Wars universe. Anyways, I believe that Omega having this high count will still be what links her, and by extension this show, to the future of the franchise. More specifically, the Rey movie and James Mangold's movie, which we know are planned to link together in some way, despite the different time periods. We know James Mangold's movie will deal with the origins of the Force, so midichlorians will surely be involved in some way. This could explain why the Force chooses certain creatures to be blessed with naturally higher M counts. Obviously, Omega herself won't appear in the film due to it being set 25,000 years before the Skywalker saga, but her M count lore could be the way the Rey movie is connected to it. To put it simply, I think Omega will be relevant to the Rey movie in some way, as Rey learns more about the Jedi of the past. And hey, it's not like she has accelerated aging, so she could very well be a very old woman by the time of the movie. Once again, maybe I'm just coping like with my Echo theory, but I haven't given up hope on Daddy Dave yet. Although, don't let it go to your head, Dave. We don't want a repeat of Mandalorian Season 3 on our hands.